Vampire romance story written by Judith. Prologue. It began with a sound, as all great humiliations do. Not the clash of steel, not the howl of battle, but the scrape of a throne being pushed back wood against stone, violence made audible. June froze in the center of the high-arched chamber, the vibrant emerald of her gown a living flame against the gray monotony of ancient stone. In her hands, she clutched a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age, a treatise on mortal philosophy she'd spent weeks translating into the old tongue. A foolish, hopeful offering for a creature who had watched civilizations burn and rebuild themselves from ash. Hope was a fragile, reckless thing, a mortal heartbeat in a room full of the dead. For 18 months, she had been that heartbeat, the human mate of Darien, the vampire king, a being of shadows and sovereignty whose chest had not risen with breath in 7 centuries. She had tried to bring warmth to his kingdom of ice and iron. She filled his chambers with candles, convinced the blood servants to allow her into the kitchens, and stood beside his throne during every tedious council session, her living warmth a stark rebellion against the cold eternity that surrounded them. She had believed, with the staggering arrogance of the beloved, that she was changing him, that her light was not being devoured by his darkness, but softening it. Tonight, the throne room was colder than usual, the torches burning low, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The vampire elders lined the walls like statues, their ancient eyes tracking her movement with the patience of predators who had all the time in the world. She had been approaching the dais, intending to take her customary place at Darien's side, when he stood. The sound of his throne scraping backward cut through the silence like a blade through silk. He flinched, away from her, before his entire court. His voice, when it came, was as cold as the tomb he'd been sealed in before his turning. The voice that had whispered her name in the darkness now wielded her devotion like a weapon. "Enough, June." The room seemed to contract. Every undead eye turned to her, drinking in her humiliation with the slow relish of creatures who had seen empires crumble but had rarely witnessed a mortal's pride shatter in real time. "You hang on me like a shroud," Darien continued, each word precise, deliberate, a surgical strike to the heart she wore so visibly. "Your constant need for attention is suffocating. Your heartbeat, your warmth, your presence. It clings to me like a stain I cannot wash away. You make me appear weak before my subjects. Give me air, June. Give me silence." The book in her hand suddenly weighed nothing. Everything weighed nothing. The floor beneath her feet, the air in her lungs, the carefully constructed illusion that she had ever mattered here. She should speak. She should defend herself, argue, weep, anything but this terrible, expanding silence. But her throat had closed around words that would sound too much like begging, and she had already been reduced enough. So instead, June did what he asked. She turned, slowly, with the careful grace of someone holding together the fragments of their dignity with sheer will alone. Her head remained high, even as the elders watched her retreat like wolves watching wounded prey drag itself from the den. She did not run. She would not give them that. But when she reached the corridor beyond the throne room, when the heavy doors closed behind her and she was finally, mercifully alone, June pressed her spine against the cold stone wall and allowed herself one truth. If Darien wanted space, she would give him an ocean so vast he would drown in it. Before we continue, I need to stop here and say thank you. Thank you for giving this story your precious time. If you're feeling this world, if June's heartbreak resonates with you, do me one favor, drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what brought you to Judy's Romance Library. Chapter 1. The Severing. The North Wing had been abandoned for so long that even the dust had given up pretending to be temporary. June stood in the doorway of what would become her new chambers, a leather travel bag in one hand and the translated treatise still clutched in the other, and surveyed the mausoleum she had chosen for herself. The air tasted of neglect and old paper, thick enough to coat her tongue. Cobwebs draped across the corners like funeral shrouds, and the single window narrow, grudging allowed only a sliver of moonlight to penetrate the gloom. It was perfect. It was exactly far enough away. She had packed in silence while Darian attended to his counsel, moving through their shared chambers like a ghost rehearsing her own disappearance. She took only what was hers, the clothes she'd brought from her mortal life, the few books that had survived her transition into this world of eternal night, a silver hairbrush her mother had given her. She left behind everything he had ever gifted her, the gowns of midnight silk, the jewels that had no warmth, the ornate combs carved from bone. She wanted nothing that would remind her she had ever believed she belonged in his bed, at his side, in his endless, merciless life. The servants had watched her go with the careful neutrality of those who served immortals and knew better than to show loyalty to the losing side. Not one of them offered to help carry her bags. Not one of them asked where she was going. They simply stepped aside as she walked past, their faces smooth as marble, already erasing her from the palace's memory. The North Wing Library had been a repository once, back when Darian's father still ruled and scholarship was valued over brutality. Now it was a graveyard of forgotten knowledge, shelf after shelf of books no one had touched in decades, perhaps centuries. The furniture was draped in cloth that disintegrated at her touch, releasing clouds of dust that made her cough a violently mortal sound in this temple of the undead. There was a desk buried beneath papers that had fused together with age and moisture, a chair with 3 legs, a bed frame that had collapsed in on itself like a rib cage. June set down her bag and looked around at the ruin she had chosen over him. The loneliness hit her then, sudden and absolute, a physical weight that drove her to her knees on the filthy floor. She had been so focused on moving, on action, on the mechanics of severing herself from Darian's life that she hadn't allowed herself to feel the magnitude of what she'd done. But here, in this forgotten wing where no one would come looking for her, where her heartbeat was the only living sound for 100 feet in any direction, the truth settled over her like a burial shroud. She was alone, utterly, completely alone. For 18 months, she had defined herself by her proximity to him. She had measured her days by the moments she could steal at his side, her worth by the frequency of his rare smiles, her entire existence by whether she could draw his attention away from the infinite tedium of immortality. And in one brutal moment before his entire court, he had made it clear that her love, her presence, her very heartbeat was not a gift but a burden he could no longer tolerate. The tears came then, hot and furious, streaming down her face in a way that would have horrified the vampire nobility. They considered mortal crying to be grotesque, an unseemly display of fluid and emotion that reminded them too much of what they'd lost. But there was no one here to be disgusted by her grief. There was no one here at all. June wept into her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of it, and the library absorbed her sorrow with the indifference of a space that had witnessed far greater losses, books that had outlived their authors, knowledge that would never again be read, love that had curdled into humiliation. When the tears finally stopped, she felt hollowed out, scraped clean. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and forced herself to stand. Her legs shook, but they held. She was still here, still breathing, still alive in a palace of the dead. She looked at the collapsed bed frame and made a decision. She would sleep on the floor tonight, wrapped in her cloak, using her bag as a pillow. Tomorrow she would begin the work of making this space habitable. She would clean the dust and repair the furniture and bring light back into this forgotten corner of Darian's kingdom. And she would do it alone, exactly as he wanted. The window showed her nothing but darkness and the distant silhouette of the mountain range that had stood here long before vampires claimed this valley as their own. June pressed her palm against the cold glass and made herself a promise in the silence. She would not beg for his attention again. She would not soften herself to fit into the spaces he allowed her. If he wanted air, she would give him so much distance that he would forget what her warmth had ever felt like. She pulled her cloak tighter and settled onto the floor, the stone cold even through the fabric. Somewhere far away, in the warm chambers she had abandoned, Darian was probably enjoying his newfound peace, relieved to be free of her suffocating presence. Let him enjoy it while it lasted. Chapter 2. The Knowledge in the Dust. The book saved her. Not immediately. The first week was survival, a grim battle against entropy and her own spiraling thoughts. But slowly, methodically, they gave her something the vampire court never had: purpose that belonged entirely to herself. June began with the practical task of making the library habitable, which required ignoring the ache in her chest every time she thought about Darian's face during his pronouncement, the cold precision of his cruelty. She swept the floors until her mortal muscles screamed in protest. She hauled buckets of water from the servants' well, the one farthest from the main palace, where she wouldn't risk encountering anyone who had witnessed her humiliation. She scrubbed the windows until weak sunlight could penetrate, though it never reached very far into the gloom. The vampires had built this wing with shadows in mind. The furniture was beyond saving, but she discovered a storage room filled with pieces from some previous century's renovation. A desk that only needed its drawers reattached. A chair with all 4 legs intact. A narrow bed with a frame that didn't immediately collapse when she tested her weight against it. She arranged them with the careful attention of someone building a life from rubble, because that was precisely what she was doing. It was while moving a stack of water-damaged texts from a lower shelf that she found it. A leather-bound volume, its cover embossed with symbols she recognized from the throne room's ancient seal. The Codex of Nocturnal Governance, read the title page. Written in the old tongue she'd spent months learning to impress a husband who had never bothered to notice. Below it, in smaller script, a complete record of covenant law, territorial rights, and judicial precedent, compiled in the 3rd century of the Long Peace. June carried it to her newly assembled desk and opened it with hands that had steadied considerably since that first night on the floor. The pages were brittle, threatening to crumble at rough handling, but the ink had survived the centuries. She began to read. The law, she discovered, was nothing like she'd expected. The vampire court presented itself as absolute monarchy, with Darian's word as final and unchallengeable. But this codex, written when his grandfather ruled, told a different story. There were checks, balances, ancient rights that predated the current dynasty. There were procedures for challenging royal decrees, protocols for territorial disputes, and most fascinating, a provision that granted consorts, regardless of their mortality, the right to petition the council directly on matters of governance. June read until her eyes burned and the candles guttered low. Then she lit new candles and read more. She discovered that the Eastern Territories, currently in dispute with a rival vampire clan, had been settled 140 years ago through a specific treaty that the current council had apparently forgotten. She learned that there were 3 different classifications of blood debt, each with different legal remedies, and that the council had been conflating them for decades, creating a backlog of unresolved grievances. She found precedent after precedent that contradicted the way Darian's court currently operated, knowledge that had been buried in this forgotten wing while the palace stumbled forward in ignorance. The books became her companions in a way the vampires never had. They didn't judge her mortal heartbeat or find her warmth offensive. They simply existed, patient and eternal, waiting for someone to value what they contained. She read through breakfast, cold bread and cheese she'd started keeping in her room to avoid the dining hall. She read through the afternoon, when the other consorts would be primping for evening court. She read deep into the night, until exhaustion finally dragged her toward sleep. Days became weeks. June ventured out only when necessary, moving through the palace like a shadow, avoiding the main corridors where she might encounter Darien or his inner circle. She didn't know if he'd noticed her absence. She told herself she didn't care. The lie was getting easier to maintain. Her appearance changed without her quite noticing. The elaborate gowns stayed folded in her trunk, replaced by simple shifts that didn't restrict her movement as she climbed library ladders to reach higher shelves. She stopped styling her hair in the intricate braids the court preferred, instead pulling it back in a practical knot that kept it out of her face while she worked. Her skin, deprived of regular sunlight, grew paler, though it would never achieve the marble perfection of the undead. She looked, she thought with grim amusement, more like a scholar than a consort. More like someone who belonged among books than beside a throne. The knowledge accumulated. She filled journal after journal with notes, cross-references, legal arguments. She began to see patterns in the codex, connections between ancient laws and current problems that the council, in their immortal arrogance, had overlooked. She wasn't just reading anymore. She was building something, an understanding, an expertise, a power that had nothing to do with whose bed she warmed. One evening, as she copied a particularly relevant passage about territorial arbitration, June realized she hadn't thought about Darien in hours. The ache was still there, a dull throb beneath her ribs, but it no longer consumed her. The suffocating wife he'd rejected was transforming into something he hadn't anticipated, something he might not even recognize. She set down her pen and looked around the library she'd reclaimed from dust. The books surrounded her like silent witnesses, their knowledge hers now, earned through solitude and determination. Darien had given her space. She'd filled it with power he couldn't take away. Let him enjoy his silence. She was done being something that could be dismissed. Chapter 3. The King's Echo Chamber. The first week without June was, Darien told himself, exactly what he needed. The chambers that had felt cluttered with her mortal warmth now breathed with proper vampiric stillness. No heartbeat disrupting his thoughts. No questions about his day, his feelings, his endless existence. No warm hand reaching for his in the darkness, as if touch could bridge the chasm between life and death. He could finally think clearly, move freely, rule without the constant reminder that he had shackled himself to something so devastatingly temporary. He told himself this every night as he sat alone in chambers that suddenly felt cavernous. The council meetings improved immediately, or so he insisted to Lucian when his brother raised an eyebrow at his third consecutive night of brooding silence. Without June's presence beside his throne, the elders focused properly on matters of state rather than sneaking glances at the mortal curiosity their king had inexplicably married. Disputes were settled with appropriate severity. Petitions were denied without the softening influence of her occasional whispered appeals for mercy. This was how a vampire court should function: cold, efficient, uncompromised by sentiment. But by the second week, the silence had begun to calcify into something oppressive. Darien found himself listening for sounds that no longer came. The rustle of fabric as she moved through the chambers, always in motion, always trying to inject life into spaces designed for death. The scratch of her pen as she wrote letters to the few mortals who still remembered her, maintaining connections to a world he'd forced her to leave behind. The soft, unconscious humming she did while reading, a habit that had irritated him to madness and that he now found himself straining to hear in the empty air. His chambers were exactly as cold as they should be. He'd lived in this temperature for 700 years. It had never bothered him before. So why did he now find himself standing before the fireplace at odd hours, staring at ashes that no one had bothered to clear because June was the only one who'd ever cared about keeping fires lit? The guards noticed first. Darien had always been demanding, exacting, but fair in his severity. Now he snapped at them for infractions so minor they barely qualified as errors. A footstep too heavy in the corridor outside his door, a delay of mere seconds in responding to his summons. The guard captain, a vampire who'd served his family for 3 centuries, began assigning the youngest soldiers to Darian's detail, the ones who hadn't yet learned to fear their king's moods. "Where is she?" Darian demanded of Lucian one evening, the question escaping before he could cage it behind his teeth. Lucian, lounging in the chair June used to occupy with a book she'd left behind, didn't even look up. The North Wing library. "She's been there since the night you publicly eviscerated her dignity. I asked her to give me space. I didn't tell her to disappear entirely." "Didn't you?" Now Lucian did look up, his ancient eyes far too knowing. "You called her suffocating, brother. You said her presence was a stain. What exactly did you expect her to do? Hover at a more acceptable distance?" Darian turned away, unwilling to see his own cruelty reflected in his brother's face. "She could attend court. She doesn't have to hide herself away like a scorned mistress." "She's not hiding. She's studying." Lucian set down the book with deliberate care. "The servants say she's taken over the entire North Wing, reading day and night. Though what she's reading, no one seems to know. The information should have been irrelevant. What did it matter what June did with her time, as long as she was no longer clinging to him like the barnacle Valorous had named her? But Darian found himself thinking about it as he sat alone in his chambers that night, the silence pressing against his eardrums like water at great depth. June, surrounded by books in that forgotten wing. June, who used to read to him by firelight, her voice warm and alive in a way that made him feel almost mortal again. He'd thought he wanted peace, but this wasn't peace. This was absence. And absence, he was discovering, had teeth. The 3rd week was worse. Darian caught himself turning toward the space beside his throne during council sessions, expecting to see green fabric and warm eyes, only to find empty air. He started sleeping during the day, when he used to stay awake to share a few hours of June's mortal schedule, and found that sleep without her breathing beside him felt less like rest and more like practicing for the grave. His dreams, rare enough for a vampire, became vivid and cruel, June laughing, June reading, June looking at him with eyes full of love he'd thrown back in her face like poison. Valorous, never one for subtlety, cornered him in the training yard. "You look like death, brother, and not in the eternal, majestic way we usually manage." "I'm fine." "You're miserable. You got exactly what you wanted, a wife who stays out of your way, and you're more insufferable than when she was following you around like a lost puppy." Valorous wiped blood from his practice blade, studying Darian with the tactical assessment he usually reserved for battlefields. "So either bring her back or stop inflicting your regret on the rest of us." But Darian couldn't bring her back. To do so would be to admit he'd been wrong, that his public humiliation of her had been less about her failings and more about his own terror at how much he'd come to depend on her warmth. Kings didn't apologize. Kings didn't admit weakness. Kings certainly didn't crawl to the North Wing to beg a mortal woman for forgiveness. So instead, he sat alone in chambers that had never felt cold before, listening to silence that used to be filled with her heartbeat, and told himself that eventually this would feel like victory. The lie was becoming harder to maintain. Chapter 4. The New Power. The territorial dispute had been festering for 6 months, a legal abscess that the council picked at during every session without ever lancing it properly. 2 vampire clans claimed the same stretch of the Eastern Valley, each insisting their claim predated the others, each threatening violence if the council didn't rule in their favor. Darian had listened to the same circular arguments for half a year, watched his advisors shuffle through incomplete records and contradictory testimonies, and was approximately 3 seconds from simply executing both clan leaders and claiming the territory for the crown when the North Wing's doors opened. June walked into the council chamber like winter itself had taken human form. The transformation was so complete that Darian almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the vibrant green gown, the carefully styled hair, the desperate eagerness to please that had radiated from her like heat from a fire. In their place, a simple gray dress that would have been at home on a monastery scholar, dark hair pulled back severely from a face that had grown sharper in absence, and eyes that looked through the assembled council with the cool assessment of someone who had stopped caring what they thought of her. She carried a book. Of course she did, but this wasn't one of her sentimental mortal volumes. This was an ancient text bound in cracked leather, the kind of tome that had been gathering dust in the north wing since before Darian's grandfather's time. The council fell silent. Every vampire in the chamber turned to stare at the mortal who had once been their king's ever-present shadow and who now felt like something else entirely, something that didn't flinch under their regard. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," June said, and her voice carried none of the warmth it used to hold when she addressed him. It was professional, distant. The voice of a scholar presenting findings, not a wife seeking approval. "But I believe I can resolve the Eastern Valley dispute." Darian's first instinct was to dismiss her, to tell her this was council business and she should return to whatever hole she'd been hiding in. But something in her posture stopped him. She stood before his throne with the same straight-backed confidence she'd had on their wedding day, before months of his cold indifference had taught her to make herself smaller. "Proceed," he heard himself say. June opened the book with hands that didn't shake. The Eastern Valley dispute rests on a misunderstanding of territorial classification under the Codex of Nocturnal Governance. Both Clan Mordain and Clan Vesper believe they're arguing over sovereign territory, which would indeed require proving historical precedents. However, she turned several pages, found her mark, and began to read. Any land claimed during the 3rd century expansion under the provision of martial settlement shall be classified as tributary territory, subject to crown redistribution at the sovereign's discretion upon the death of the original claimant. She looked up, meeting Darian's gaze for the first time in 3 months. There was no love in those eyes anymore, only the sharp satisfaction of someone who'd found the answer everyone else had missed. Lord Mordain's claim traces back to his great-grandfather, who settled the valley in the 3rd century as a reward for military service. Upon his death 70 years ago, the land should have reverted to crown control for reassignment. It never did, because no one bothered to check the original settlement terms. The valley isn't disputed territory between two clans. It's crown land that's been illegally occupied for 7 decades. The silence that followed was absolute. Darian saw his senior advisor's face go carefully blank, the expression of someone realizing they'd overlooked something catastrophically obvious. Lord Mordain, present to argue his case, looked like he'd been struck. Clan Vesper's representative was already calculating how to curry favor with a king who suddenly had leverage. Lucian broke first, leaning forward with undisguised interest. "Where did you find that codex?" "The North Wing Library." June's answer was directed at Lucian, not Darian, a subtle shift in allegiance that landed like a blade between his ribs. "Along with approximately 40 other legal texts that haven't been consulted in at least 2 centuries. The collection is quite comprehensive, if one bothers to look." The implication hung in the air. None of them had bothered. The immortals, so proud of their accumulated centuries, had allowed crucial knowledge to gather dust, while a mortal woman who'd been alive for barely 3 decades had done the work they'd neglected. Darian found himself looking at June as if seeing her for the first time. Not the eager girl who'd tried so hard to fit into his world, not the suffocating presence he'd needed to escape, but this a woman who'd taken the exile he'd forced upon her and turned it into power he couldn't dismiss. She stood before his throne not as a supplicant but as an expert, and every vampire in the chamber knew it. "The crown claims the Eastern Valley," Darian said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. Both clans have 30 days to vacate. Lord Mordain, you'll answer separately for the illegal occupation. He shifted his gaze back to June, trying to find some trace of the woman who used to look at him like he'd hung the stars. Your research is valuable. I'm pleased to be of service to the crown. The formal distance in her words was worse than shouting. She inclined her head, not a bow, just acknowledgement, and turned to leave. June. Her name escaped him before he could stop it. She paused, didn't turn. Yes, Your Majesty? The title felt like a door closing. He searched for words that wouldn't sound like begging, came up empty, and settled for, "The Council would benefit from your continued scholarship. Then the Council knows where to find me." She walked out, taking the ancient codex and every scrap of warmth with her, leaving Darian sitting on a throne that suddenly felt like exactly what it was. A very cold, very lonely seat. Chapter 5. The Wall Between Them. Darian stood outside the north wing like a beggar at a gate, and the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd crossed battlefields without hesitation, entered enemy strongholds alone, faced down rival kings with nothing but his will and 7 centuries of accumulated rage. But this door, plain oak, slightly warped from decades of neglect, might as well have been fortress walls for how effectively it kept him out. He'd waited 3 days after the council session, telling himself he was being strategic, giving her time to settle back into obscurity before he reminded her of her place. The lie had lasted approximately until Lucian found him staring at the north wing entrance like it might spontaneously combust, and asked if he planned to grow roots or actually do something about his obvious misery. So here he stood, at an hour that was neither night nor day, when the palace held its breath between the vampire's waking and the servant's dawn duties. He'd come alone, without guards or witnesses, because some humiliations deserved privacy. He knocked. The sound echoed wrong in the abandoned corridor. Too loud, too mortal. Silence answered. Darian knocked again, harder. "June, I know you're in there." More silence, but this kind had texture. This was the silence of someone on the other side of the door, listening, choosing not to respond. "I want to speak with you." His hand was on the latch now, muscle memory from 700 years of going wherever he pleased in his own palace. The door didn't budge. Locked. She'd locked the door against him. Against her king. Against her husband. Something hot and unfamiliar twisted in his chest, humiliation mixed with something that felt dangerously close to panic. "June, please." The word tasted foreign in his mouth. Kings didn't say please. But apparently desperate fools did, and he'd apparently joined their ranks somewhere between the council session and this moment of standing outside a locked door, begging for scraps of attention from a woman he'd publicly eviscerated 3 months ago. The door opened 6 inches, just enough for June's face to appear in the gap, backlit by candlelight that turned her features into a study of shadows and sharp edges. She looked at him the way one might look at a stranger making an unexpected request. Polite, distant, utterly unmoved. "Your Majesty, is there council business that requires my attention?" The formal address was a knife between his ribs. "No, I came to..." What? Apologize? Explain? Beg her to come back to chambers that felt like a tomb without her? He hadn't actually planned this far ahead. "I wanted to see how you were settling in." How considerate. Her expression didn't shift. "I'm settling in well. The library is quite adequate for my needs. Was there anything else?" She was going to close the door. He could see it in the minute shift of her weight, the way her hand tightened on the edge. Desperation made him stupid. "Let me in." No. The refusal was so calm, so absolute, that it took him a moment to process it. No. She'd said no. To him, to a direct request from her king. "That wasn't a request, June. And this isn't your chamber, Your Majesty. This is my private residence, which you graciously suggested I establish when you found my presence in yours to be suffocating." Her voice remained perfectly level, but he caught the blade hidden in the courtesy. "I'm simply respecting your wishes." The wall between them might as well have been stone instead of oak. He could see her through the gap close enough to touch if she'd let him, close enough to see the faint shadows under her eyes from too many nights reading by insufficient candlelight, but she'd never been more distant. This was the June he'd created with his cruelty, the one who'd learned that love offered to him was a weakness to be exploited. "I miss you." The admission escaped before he could cage it, raw and unguarded, in a way that made him want to claw the words back from the air. Something flickered across her face. Not softening, not forgiveness, something that looked almost like pity. "You miss having someone warm your bed and sit beside your throne and make you feel less alone in your immortality. You don't miss me, Darian. You never actually saw me long enough to miss who I am." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less cutting. "I gave you everything I had. I reshaped my entire existence around you. And you called it suffocating, so I stopped. And now you're discovering that the absence of suffocation is called drowning. June, I have work to do. The Council's legal archives are a disaster, and someone needs to catalog them before the next territorial dispute erupts." She stepped back from the door. "If you need my expertise on a matter of governance, send word through proper channels. Otherwise, please respect the space you so desperately required." The door closed. He heard the lock slide home with a finality that felt like a period at the end of a sentence he'd been too arrogant to see coming. Darian stood there long after her candlelight dimmed behind the door, his palm pressed against the oak like he could push through wood and pride to reach her. On the other side, he knew she stood as well. He could hear her heartbeat, that mortal rhythm he'd once found intrusive and now strained to catch like a drowning man reaching for the surface. They were separated by 6 inches of wood and an ocean of his own making, and for the first time in 7 centuries, Darian understood what it meant to be powerless. Chapter 6. The Tribunal Atonement. The Blood Moon Tribunal convened on the anniversary of June's humiliation, though Darian suspected the timing was Lucian's deliberate cruelty. The entire court assembled in the Great Hall, vampire nobility from every corner of the kingdom, gathered to address grievances, settle disputes, and perform the ancient rituals that kept their society from devolving into chaos. It was the most public, most formal gathering of the year. June sat with the legal council. Not beside his throne, where she'd once perched like an exotic bird in her vibrant gowns. Not in the consort section with the other mortal spouses who'd been turned or collected by the nobility, but with the advisors, in the gray robes of an official scholar, a thick codex open on her lap and her attention focused entirely on the proceedings as if Darian didn't exist. He'd watched her all morning, watched her explain a point of law to Elder Constantine, who'd been a judge for 300 years and was listening to her like a student. Watched her make a notation in her codex that had 2 other council members leaning in to see what she'd found. Watched her exist in his court, essential and valued and completely beyond his reach. The irony was exquisite. He'd wanted her to stop suffocating him with her presence. Now she was here, closer than she'd been in months, and he couldn't breathe for wanting her to look at him the way she looked at those ancient texts, like he mattered, like he was worth her attention, like he was something other than a mistake she'd learned to work around. The morning's business concluded. The tribunal broke for the traditional mid-session recess, when the vampires would feed and the mortal attendees would gratefully escape to where the air didn't taste quite so much like death. June gathered her materials with practiced efficiency, clearly planning to retreat to whatever corner she'd claimed as her own. Darian stood. The scrape of his throne against stone cut through the ambient conversation, drawing every eye in the hall. He descended from the dais, each step measured, deliberate, irrevocable. The crowd parted for him automatically, they always did, but this time their deference felt like bearing witness rather than simple respect. June had frozen halfway to the exit, Codex clutched to her chest, her face carefully neutral. But he saw the moment she understood where he was walking. Saw her spine straighten, her chin lift. That warrior's pride that had been forged in the crucible of his rejection. He crossed the floor that separated them. Decades of protocol, centuries of pride, the entire weight of his authority as king. He set it all aside and knelt at her feet. The court's collective gasp was a physical presence. Darian looked up at the woman he'd broken and who'd rebuilt herself into something he couldn't command or dismiss. Her face was porcelain, revealing nothing, but her heartbeat had quickened. He could hear it, that mortal rhythm that had once annoyed him and now sounded like the only honest thing in a room full of immortals who'd forgotten how to feel. I was wrong. His voice carried in the absolute silence, because of course it did. Every vampire in the hall had hearing sharp enough to catch a whisper from across the kingdom. That night, when I called you suffocating, when I said your presence made me weak, I was wrong. You weren't making me weak. You were showing me I'd become so cold that warmth felt like an attack. June's knuckles were white on the codex. She didn't speak, didn't help him. Why would she? He'd taught her that vulnerability was a weapon to be used against her. I thought I needed space. I thought your love was a burden I couldn't bear. He pulled his signet ring from his finger, the symbol of his authority that he'd worn for 7 centuries, and held it up to her. I was a fool, and I've spent 3 months drowning in the space I demanded, watching you transform into someone so formidable that the entire council defers to your expertise, and realizing that I don't want a wife who stays in the shadows. I want you. The you who locks her door against me. The you who tells me no. The you who's too busy cataloging legal archives to care if I'm miserable. He set the ring on the floor between them, a surrender more absolute than any battlefield defeat. This ring means I share my authority with you. Not as a consort who decorates my throne, but as a partner who shapes how this kingdom is governed. You've already proven you're better at it than half my council. His voice cracked an undead thing that shouldn't crack but did. I'm asking you to stay, not for me. Not even because I love you, though I do, and I should have said it every day instead of treating your love like an inconvenience, but because this kingdom needs you. And because I am on my knees in front of everyone who witnessed your humiliation, begging you to give me the chance to deserve you. The silence stretched. June looked down at him with eyes that had learned to guard themselves, that no longer showed him the vulnerable heart she'd once offered so freely. Then she spoke, and her voice was steady. Pick up your ring, Darian. His chest hollowed. She was refusing. She was going to. Pick it up, she repeated, because I'm not taking a symbol of authority I haven't earned. If I'm going to be your partner, it won't be because you handed me power in a moment of guilt. It will be because I built it myself, which I've already started doing. She paused. But I will stay, not in your chambers, not as the decoration you can dismiss when I become inconvenient. I stay as myself, with my own space, my own work, my own boundaries that you will respect. Yes. He would have agreed to anything, would have given her the entire kingdom if she'd asked. And you will never, her voice sharpened, never humiliate me like that again. You want vulnerability, you want warmth, then you protect it, you honor it. You don't weaponize it the moment it makes you uncomfortable. Never, he swore, and meant it with everything he had left. June held out her hand, not to help him up, just offering it, a beginning, not a reconciliation. Darian took it, felt her living warmth against his dead cold, and understood that he was being given something more precious than forgiveness. He was being given a chance. He stood, still holding her hand, and faced his court. Scholar June will be joining the legal council in an official capacity. Her expertise in nocturnal law is without peer. You will treat her accordingly. Then, quieter, just for her, thank you. June's expression softened fractionally. Not love, not yet. Maybe not ever, not the way it used to be. But something real, something earned. You have a lot of work to do, Your Majesty, she said. I suggest you start by reading the Codex of Nocturnal Governance, Chapter 6, specifically. It covers the legal obligations of monarchs to their partners. You might find it educational. Despite everything, Darian smiled. This June, sharp, uncompromising, unmoved by his authority, was going to make his immortal life significantly more complicated. He was looking forward to it. They didn't go back to shared chambers. June kept her library wing, and Darian visited only when invited, learning to knock and wait like a suitor rather than a king. They worked together on the council, where her knowledge complemented his experience, and slowly, painfully slowly built something that looked less like a marriage of convenience and more like a partnership of equals. It wasn't the desperate, clinging love she'd offered before. It was better. It was real. It was a love that had survived rejection and rebuilt itself on foundations of respect. And on the nights when she did invite him to her chambers, when they sat by her fire reading legal texts and arguing precedent, Darian thought that this hard-won, carefully boundaried warmth was worth more than 1,000 years of cold solitude. He'd wanted space. She'd given him space, and then filled it with herself in ways he'd never anticipated. And somewhere in that transformation, he'd learned what it meant to be grateful. We've reached the end, and if you made it this far, you're my people. But listen, I need more from you than just passive listening. If this story wrecked you in the best way, if you felt every moment of June's transformation from discarded wife to untouchable force, then you need to take action right now. Here's what I need you to do, and I'm not asking nicely anymore. Like this video, not later, not maybe, right now. Your like is currency in the algorithm war, and without it, this story dies in obscurity while trash content thrives. Comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Was it the throne room rejection, June mastering ancient law, Darian on his knees at the tribunal? Your comment, even if it's just one word, tells the platform this video is worth promoting. Share this story. Send it to your group chats. Post it on your story. Tag someone who needs to hear about a woman who chose herself. You want more stories like this? Then you have to be the one who makes them successful. And subscribe to Judy's Romance Library if you haven't already, because I'm building a collection of the most emotionally devastating, beautifully crafted romance stories you'll ever hear, and you don't want to miss a single one. Don't just be a consumer, be a champion for the stories you love, because I'm fighting for you in the comments, in the community posts, in every upload, but I can't fight the algorithm alone. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Do it now, before you scroll away and forget. This is how we build something bigger than just one story. This is how we create a library. I'll see you in the next one. And trust me, you're not ready for what's coming.